Howdy, fellas. How are you feeling right now? Seriously, how do you feel? That's like not a rhetorical question. Right now, what is it you feel inside your soul? Stop! Don't intellectualize that there is no such thing as a soul in order to evade the question. Don't talk about your foot pain or some old sports injury. Just sit there a moment and sense how you feel. Are you alright? By which I mean, is what you describe how you are currently feeling as maybe I don't know good? I'm glad to hear it, but there's actually no expectation of you pretending to be fine right now. I'm asking, but I can't actually listen to you say it. No one is judging but yourself. Are you not sure? Is it just sort of nothing? Maybe a little bit empty. You feel like it was more of a reflex to say good or alright. That is, after all, what you're supposed to say if you don't want to make anyone uncomfortable. Maybe you're getting a little angry that I'm asking this question at all. Like, who the fuck am I to intrude on you like this, right? Make you think about this stupid fucking bullshit. If you're horny, fair, I'm flattered, but now is neither the time nor the place. How many emotions do you know? I'm not just asking how many words that describe emotion, I'm asking how they feel. What experience are people trying to convey when they use those words? It's like colors. When I say blue or green or yellow, you hear the word and you know what the color looks like in your head. When I say perplexed, hysterical, enchanted, what do you feel? Those are sort of among the chartreuse and fuchsia of the emotion world, so how about like proud, tender, stunned? Is it easy? Or is it hard? These are not just words that people say, they are real things that people feel inside of themselves. And here's the tricky bit, you can be able to identify them very well in others, but not in yourself. So how come you're having such a difficult time with all this? I'll tell you why. It's because your soul has been killed. And not just killed, but murdered. This goes way deeper than just your emotions, but your emotions are the cause of death. They have been mutilated to an extent that your soul died of the blood loss. All the superfluous bits sliced away with a big rusty cleaver, carved into a very particular shape, leaving only the most basal forms of anger and maybe a little fear. It really depends on the butcher if they left that on. Some like to, leave it because it makes their job easier. Others are particularly meticulous in removing it. And the reason this was done to you is because you are a man. No other way of putting it, if you were raised as a man, there is a 95% chance this was deliberately done to you by the people who raised you and the society you were exposed to. I have never, in my entire life, met a man who was in touch with his emotions and whose journey was not an arduous task of reclamation of that part of himself he at one point didn't even know he had lost. If you're not a man, and or you were not raised as a man, and you can relate to this, welcome, congratulations, you were probably emotionally neglected as a child. So stay on, this video is for you too, and maybe you'll be able to share some wisdom, as chances are you have encountered a few more ways out of this. Because when it comes to men, the androcide of our emotional selves is systemic. And the world we live in is structured in a way that fundamentally puts every hurdle it can between us and the ability to feel. Emotionally neglecting boys and men is the standard encouraged practice of our society. So many men live their entire lives in a state of total dissociation from their emotions and their emotional selves. And quite honestly, who cares? No, seriously, who cares? We're not doing rhetorical questions today. Who in society really gives a fuck if men are suffering the wounds of having a mutilated soul incapable of experiencing life as human beings are supposed to experience it? Even the very notion that men have pressure to conform to gender expectations is considered ridiculous by so many people simply because they do not want to hear it. The idea makes them uncomfortable. Some people pretend to care. It sure has become very fashionable these past few years to decorate yourself with that. But when push comes to shove and they experience the slightest bit of discomfort in how they view the world, that support tends to quickly evaporate. They're men! How bad can it be? The whole world is made for them. They can fix their own problem. There's real people out there who actually need help, and we're talking about men's bruised egos and their fifis. Almost 30% of homeless people out there freezing in the streets right now are women. 20% of homicide victims getting killed right now are women. Those are real issues, not men's feelings. You see what happens? Because you'll find posters and campaigns about these sorts of issues all the time. Do you see how you think about men who are suffering, and in this case not just their emotional selves, but suffering like homelessness and murder? And do you see how, you don't really care as much? Because it's just one of those things that are sad in an abstract sense, but, what are you gonna do about it? You wish it wasn't happening, but Can you hear yourself rationalizing intellectually why it is actually worse when bad things happen to women? I'm not saying this to be disparaging. Women have a whole host of their own problems. It's a long fucking list, and anyone who doesn't recognize that is living with their eyes closed. You'll just also happen to be the only available game in town to compare men to. When we talk about women's issues, we also use the measure of how men are treated in society to highlight problems and disadvantages they deal with, and we don't mean it disparagingly to men, right? Yes, trans and non-binary folks exist, but let's be serious, most people, even if they are supportive, don't really understand what that means. It's more of a live and let live type situation, so they don't really factor into the discussion too much unless we're talking about edge cases. And we are not talking about edge cases today. We are talking about how society oppresses men. And you see how I had to pay lip service to other groups who also have problems in order to even gain any permission to speak at all about this? In all but the most fringe circles of society, saying I don't care about women's issues will not give you a particularly good social standing. Rightly so, let's be fair here. And in all but the most fringe circles of society, saying there's a lot of problems for women in society is kind of an obvious statement. Like, yeah, that's true. It does not, in fact, require you to say, but men have problems too. You can just say women's problems are real. And just to clear up any confusion, politics Twitter is one of the more fringe circles of society because it will invariably attract people from the most fringe circles of society. I know it's cold out right now in most of the world, but please, touch grass. Why do we assume talking about men's issues takes something away from women's issues anyway? Personally, somewhat controversially, I think it's because we give a shit about one and don't about the other. And it's easy to define all this in adversarial terms, so we rationalize our cruel apathy as just caring about a thing that's more important. There's plenty of great videos about women's issues. This isn't one of them. Whoever you are, obviously, I hope you watch this video, but understand that parts of it may make you uncomfortable, just like talking about women's issues made men uncomfortable for many, many decades, and still does today. And related to that, I just like to point this out because it's such an unbelievably stupid argument I see all over discourse. This right here, this up here, is a representation of how wind works, right? But this other image down here is how the prevailing winds actually work. And you may be able to tell that these two are not identical, and sometimes the lower one contradicts the upper one. That doesn't mean the upper one is untrue, it just means that the upper one represents an underlying principle of a highly complex and faceted phenomenon, and the lower one includes all the eddies and exceptions that happen because of all that complexity and all of those many facets. This follows from this. This holds up here. It is the underlying reason for why this looks the way it does. And this has deeper exceptions through time as well. Every couple of years, the dry climate of the western coast of South America is hit by an incredible amount of rainfall because of oceanic wind patterns of the Pacific reverse, and there is an El Nino event. That doesn't mean they don't usually move in this direction. So if you hear an idealized general statement in this or any other video essay, you can't go, actually, I can think of a specific scenario where that doesn't happen, therefore the original thesis is incorrect. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. So what happened? Why is it that some of you fellas haven't cried in a decade? Why is there a void inside of yourself you cannot fill with any of the things everyone keeps telling you you can fill it with? Those of you who have money find that it has not filled it. Those of you with status find that it has not filled it. Those of you with tons of sex find that it has not filled it. And the worst thing is, you might be so caught up in pretending that you haven't listened inside yourself for a while. After all, these are the aesthetics of successful men. But do they make you happy? Or do they just, take away the pressure a little bit? Alleviate that fear that people will see you as lesser? And if you have none of those things, well, you probably don't even know they won't make you happy, do you? Because you sure are chasing them, probably. It's unthinkable, I assume, in your mind, that they wouldn't make you happy, right? Here's the big secret that most people don't understand, I think. Men don't feel powerful either. They just pretend to. The feeling of power is something that is promised to us but never delivered, because if it was delivered, we'd cease making the constant soul-rending sacrifices society demands of us. It is imperative for society to make men feel powerless as often as possible. But we can never talk about it, never admit it. After all, we have everything. People who have money, power, pussy, they are the peak of privilege. They have destroyed lives to get there. It would be laughable for them to complain. And if they did, well, that would really just mean that they failed. It's not that these things are unattainable, it's that they don't nourish your soul. But this is the message you've received your whole life, and the core trapping of that is stop showing what you feel, because if you do, you cannot get these things. Being held back by your feelings is going to hinder your grind. It's going to make you vulnerable to the people trying to rise above you. It's going to make women not want to fuck you. It isn't so much said outright, though sometimes it can be as well. When you complain about something, when there is a tear in your eye, when you get excited and all giggly, be a man, they'll say. Stop whining. Don't cry, you little fucking bitch. Contain yourself. You know what you should do instead? You should be angry. You should be mad. Here, have a drink. Numb your pain. Beat that guy up. He insulted you. Be loud. Be raucous. Be violent. Be stoic. Deal with it by being strong. Deal with it by saying nothing or by punishing those who are weaker than you for it. I remember very vividly an incident from high school that was an eye-opening moment for me. A guy who was well and truly abused at home just sat in the hallway and openly cried. And people were either disgusted by it or bewildered. Some were empathetic, with no idea what to do though, myself included. I didn't know how to react to this situation. A few people later said he was being manipulative, doing it out in public like that. He should have done that in private. When a man displays emotion, the response is usually going to be more about why he chose to display that emotion, much more so than, the actual emotion that he is feeling. Because nobody really cares how he feels, unless it's anger. Especially if that anger becomes violence, then it's a problem. Then the true nature of men is revealed, and it's because men are bad, and men are evil, and men are mad that women are finally winning in society, and men are hateful that minorities are allowed, and men are lazy, and men are entitled, and men are pathetic worms who cannot get their shit together, and men are terrifying monsters whose very existence needs to be curtailed. What has happened in many ways is that men have even been banned from expressing anger, the only emotion they used to be allowed to express. People often assume men never hear bad things said about them, and if they do, they can handle it, because after all, They're men, they're supposed to be able to handle that. So we say all manner of unspeakable shit to them and about them. We make it a sport to say the most hurtful things possible, not even as a joke, but as an act of self-empowerment. We see men and we want to feel more powerful than them. Do you know about the man flu? You know, the thing we just do when men are sick, where we make fun of the fact that they express the fact that they are sick and experiencing pain and discomfort. Anytime a man shows any sort of emotion that isn't anger, they need to justify it. And it's an entirely tolerable meme in our society to say that your literal body being in the process of destroying themselves is no justification. Just shut the fuck up and take your medicine. Nobody cares about protecting men's feelings. It's a laughable notion. It's a notion that makes us uncomfortable because whatever image we have of men, they are stoic forces of nature, not people with complex internal worlds. Men only understand hierarchy and domination and must be put in their place. If you are someone who has gone on like a journey of self-discovery to reclaim your emotions, it's hard to break out of this. Because when you try to genuinely engage and be part of a community of equals, to contribute selflessly, you will be tread upon by other men who feel that you must be weak and easy pickings in the dominance hierarchy. The moment you allow someone space, the moment you show a bit of vulnerability, the moment you're not actively jockeying for the spot of top dog, some motherfucker is going to see it and think, oh, this guy, he fucking looks like I could eat him. I should shit on him to make myself look better. Especially as a young man, if you go into the trades, but also at university, like fraternity specifically, and of course, most classically, the armed forces, the hazings, the punishments, the inhumane ways in which you are treated. We expect young men to put themselves through the most traumatic shit and then shake our heads that they were stupid enough to put themselves through that like it's a choice. It's not just men who do this, women do it all the time. We like to believe this bullshit mythos of the enlightened gender, but women are just as callous and or compassionate as everyone else. But then women also want something else, don't they? They want us to be loving, compassionate, kind. They want us to know how they feel. They want us to express our feelings. Except, of course, when you do that, somehow you didn't do it right. And suddenly they're calling you an asshole or a pussy. Yes, women watching this video, you may not be the person to do this. You may not be part of the problem. But this is one of the key experiences of existing as a man. In spite of the fact that men are constantly told in no uncertain terms to not be emotional, they are also, especially in modern society, often told to show their emotions, and a lot of people actually mean this. But then the men don't do it. Or they express anger, the only emotion they know, and then people are confused and blame the men for it. Do you know the thing that happens sometimes when you are bullied as a child, where people will say, oh, do this and that, implying that this will garner their approval. And then when you've done it, they all laugh at you and call you a fucking retard for doing the thing they wanted you to do. This is how it feels to take seriously the assurances of most people that you can be emotional and insecure around them for men. Every man who has ever tried to open up to anyone has had this experience at some point. Because there's a lot of emotional predators out there who are just out to control and humiliate men. We will, as a society, constantly expect men, especially the most soul-deadened and closed-off ones, to open up and be emotional, and then be the same people that exploit any chink of vulnerability in their armor and stab, stab, stab. And that is why, even if your intentions are entirely pure, a man is currently not opening up to you. It's trauma. And it's a trauma you can't talk about, not just because, he can't really put it into words, but because he's been conditioned never to talk about it through bad experience after bad experience. Because if you're a guy and someone treated you horribly, you probably did something wrong and deserved it. You ever have this impulse where you just want to be gentle and kind with someone, but you just cannot do it? You ever know that you did wrong, but you physically cannot admit it because it would make you open to attack and annihilation. Almost every man has experienced this, time after time, often when they were young, because this is childhood trauma. Boys are easy to raise. What a prevalent meme in our society. Parents are glad when boys are born because they know they won't have to deal with having to figure out all their little child feelings like they would if the kid was a girl. They'll destroy your house, sure, but that's countable labor, damage control. You can just punish them for it when they do something really egregious. When your little girl cries, you have to figure out why and then fix that somehow, or at least listen to it. When a boy cries, you can just tell him to stop, because crying is for girls, that'll shut him up. Dunzo. Boys are not easy to raise. They're just as difficult as girls. We just don't put in that work with them. We treat them more like animals, really, because dogs, they will destroy your house as well, and then you punish them for it because they can't help themselves, and boys are exactly the same. We don't examine why they're destroying the house. We don't examine why they're violent and rambunctious. That's just how boys are. There is no need to question this, and there is no need to interfere. I often see people complaining about the phrase boys will be boys like it's a permission slip for boys to be free and do what they want. So we teach boys that they can get away with anything, and that's all it is. But what it really is a free pass for the emotional neglect of their personhood. Because the only time they will get their parents to pay attention to them is when they do violence, when they break shit, when they hurt people, when they throw a tantrum. We condition them from a very early age to only express an extremely limited range of emotions. When they're not expressing those emotions, they might as well not exist. Or worse, we tell them they're doing something wrong. There is a point fairly early on in every boy's childhood where the love they receive, usually from their mothers, disappears. Any care and attention that might have been there is, sometimes abruptly, sometimes gradually, taken away. Because we don't want our boys to grow up weak. Men are groomed from childhood to be violent. Whenever they do not get what they want, they need to prove that they are strong enough to take it through force. Because if they do not, they are nobody, and people will walk all over them. We know the sort of lives pathetic, weak men lead, and we don't want that for our child. Girls we will talk about feelings with, we try to figure out what is wrong, and in the process of doing that, teach them how to label their emotions, to understand them, to process them, and thereby to know that emotions are scary, yes, but also wonderful, and something that you can and should live with. Very few parents do this with their boys, even today. And while it's easy to think of this in the context of the traditional nuclear family, let's be serious, women are no better at this. They don't care more. Many of them are more extreme precisely because they are afraid that their influence will raise an effeminate boy who will be easily subjugated. I saw this quote somewhere on the internet, but it stuck with me for days. A lot of single mothers do not parent their sons, but just wait until they are old enough to be handed off to someone else's daughter. Women often feel like they have a right to reshape men's personalities in whatever way suits them because of this. It is a social expectation almost at this point that when a man settles down, the woman will tame him and house train him basically. The man's interest in personality is often eroded away in this process because it doesn't really matter. It's uncivilized, animalistic, vestigial. And then we act with shock and surprise when young men want girlfriends that are basically surrogate mothers. We shame them for it, like it's wrong to want care and affection, like it's an act of oppression to want to feel taken care of. We don't shame women for wanting to be with a strong guy who will protect them and make them feel safe. That's after all what a man is supposed to do. Sometimes it's also just easiest to control the child by taking away love, because it'll try to get your approval back as a parent. That's a position of power, and after all, it is inborn to the male condition to only understand power and domination. That's why we only expose them to power and domination, because what's the point in even trying anything else? We call this love, and then we wonder why men don't understand what the word even means. When you grow up as a man, it can be hard to make sense of the idea that somehow, you know, people say this, it's like immensely difficult to love and be vulnerable. It requires so much like internal strength to do this. Because you are already spending all of your strength on not loving and not being vulnerable, and that is immensely difficult. Of course, boys are going to cauterize that whole part of themselves. It's horrifying to have to exist with this monstrous vortex of feelings inside of yourself, unable to process them, to even identify what's going on, and constantly taught that even so much as having them makes you unworthy of existing as a human being. It's a super common thing for boys to decide to no longer feel. I know I did this several times when I was a teenager. They will kill their own souls, commit emotional suicide, just so their body can survive the constant dominance power struggle that the rest of their lives will be defined by. But somehow, for some reason I have yet to fully understand, we as a society expect men to also be good at something we never taught them, and which we in fact violently discouraged them from learning. And then because they are men, we blame them for failing at it, belittle them for being unable to solve their own problems, when the thing that was taken away from them is so foundational that they cannot even understand that it is missing, furthering that whole cycle of controlling men by making them feel inherently inadequate. The ghost of these severed emotions is still there. Whether in the recesses of your memory, resonances in the world around you, reminders that actually you are weak for this thing you don't have. This is the reason why the male suicide rate is so astronomical, why men suffer disproportionately from addiction and workaholism that destroys their bodies, why they are constantly doing unbelievably dangerous and stupid shit. It's why men die younger, and it's why you, dear viewer, feel like shit pretty much all the time, and why the only reaction you ever get for it is contempt. You know what I hear when incels talk? I am in unspeakable pain and do not know why or how to make it stop. People get really angry with me when I say this because I'm trying to, humanize human beings? Paint failed men as emotionally complex creatures? Remind you that these evil woman-hating guys do in fact have feelings, that their existence is valid even though you are personally disgusted with them? I make you feel guilty for hating the traumatized? They were mutilated through emotional abuse when they were at their most vulnerable stage in life, and now they're being victim blamed for that. Especially by the sort of people who think themselves enlightened and call themselves feminist. Which is sort of weird, isn't it? I mean, I'm just saying, it's odd that they, of all people, would dehumanize systematically abused men so much, when basically since the 80s it was feminist scholars who wrote about all this shit, who looked at the systems prevalent in our society and said, look at this shit, this is terrible, these men are suffering, we need to do something about this. They even had names for it. They called the system that hurt boys and men in this way the patriarchy. They called this pain and its consequences for men and the people around them toxic masculinity. Yeah, toxic masculinity isn't just about what men do on the outside. People forget about this part because they don't really think of men having an inside. Now, these are not just any feminists. They were intersectional feminists, whose base premise is that gender isn't the only thing in the universe, and there are hundreds of complicated intersecting systems and identities every human being carries around that impact their lives. And they have written at length about how so many parts of the feminist movement have ignored the harm patriarchy does to boys, so they could focus on the simplistic notion that men are bad, women are good, and if society less man and more woman, then more gooder. They have described how the one project that most feminist activists and political power has been invested in is to just change patriarchy in a way that make it so women can also be patriarchs. Plenty of critiques of how many feminist institutions had themselves become patriarchal in that they didn't try to change how the pie was distributed, didn't try to abolish the underlying hierarchies and systems of domination, but just wanted to make sure women got a piece of the patriarchy pie also. They thought as I do, that this sort of thinking is actually extremely harmful to the cause of feminism. In many nominally feminist places, leveling empty criticisms at men for problematic behavior, usually because you've found some way of interpreting what they have said as insensitive or patriarchal in a Freudian sense, is just a new way to assert dominance, usually done by other men, but also plenty of other people. I think men recognize this sort of posturing behavior because we are very attuned to it, and I think it is why many men just do not believe feminist activists when they say they want to do away with domination. And if we're honest, most of the big discourse that today labels itself as feminist is patriarchal, especially when it comes to men. It does its best to dehumanize them, to invalidate them, to take away their essential personhood for not living up to a performative standard that is in and of itself inherently paradoxical. Feel but don't feel. Be everything but be nothing. Don't take up space anywhere, ever. And then, not only do non-intersectional modern feminists not provide any mechanisms or programs or just general help to men who have been destroyed by patriarchy, they actively push them away and try to sabotage any and all efforts by intersectional feminists to offer a path to wholeness, to fucking sanity. Are you surprised that an entire gender groomed from the earliest days of their childhood to think that they are either nothing or a monster will, in trying to square that circle and avoid being destroyed by its agony, look for help? And when the literal only help available to them that isn't gated behind volumes and volumes of critical theory deep lore is Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson, who tell them, yeah, the reason you are hurting is because you are not enough of a monster. You should hate and subjugate women to numb this pain. And also, I am not just the patriarchy wearing a fake mustache. Are you then surprised that they take this only help offered? The response to this tends to be, well, we shouldn't have to waste our time helping them. They should just know how not to be evil and figure that shit out for themselves. Which to me really sounds like, why should I respect women and be nice to them if they won't fuck me anyway? It's a waste of my time that I have nothing to gain from. If you're not running in feminist circles, which I suspect many of the people watching this video are not, you may not know this, but especially among intersectional feminists, this sort of attitude is a little controversial because of the small fact that emotionally neglecting men and only acknowledging their basic personhood of their not being a burden to anyone is extremely fucking patriarchal. So if you are going boohoo men about all this, you are part of the problem, and also kind of a patriarchal piece of shit. There is a quote I would like to read from Bell Hooks' 2004 book, The Will to Change: Men, Masculinity, and Love, which I don't often do, but this quote is just so perfect, and I have been posting it everywhere anyway, and I highly recommend this book to everyone who hasn't yet read it. It's not just a really eye-opening read, but also, unfortunately, one of the few books that even exist on this subject matter. Most of the things Bell Hooks cites in it is not feminist literature, and that is one of her critiques, that despite men being pretty much half the people oppressed by patriarchy, there is a dearth of feminist analysis regarding ways in which they are oppressed and strategies for their liberation. Quote begins, "Undoubtedly, one of the first revolutionary acts of visionary feminism must be to restore maleness and masculinity as an ethical, biological category divorced from the dominator model. This is why the term patriarchal masculinity is so important, for it identifies male difference as being always and only about the superior rights of males to dominate, be their subordinates females or any other group deemed weaker, by any means necessary. Rejecting this model for a feminist masculinity means that we must define maleness as a state of being rather than as a performance. Male being, maleness, masculinity must stand for the essential core goodness of the self, of the human body that has a penis. Many of the critics who have written about masculinity suggest that we need to do away with the term, that we need an end to manhood. Yet such a stance furthers the notion that there is something inherently evil, bad, or unworthy about maleness. End quote. Which there isn't. There is nothing wrong with being a man. We've developed a tendency to forget this sometimes, but identifying as a man, regardless of your genitals of course, but this is something that by and large affects cis men more because we've always lived with the male experience, is not harmful to society. You are not a monster. And the idea that you are is toxic and patriarchal. Feminism did not do this to men. It isn't because of feminism that men are isolated and alone, alienated from ourselves. You can make an argument that through its public efforts to monopolize the fight against patriarchy and its ultimate refusal to actually do something about this particular aspect of it, the vague and nebulous concept of the feminist movement has certainly made the problem worse, but it did not create it. That was patriarchy. A patriarchy that many people also forget is not made by men, upheld by men for the benefit of men, but made by patriarchs, upheld by everyone for the benefit of patriarchs. Women are agents of the patriarchy as well, and if you don't know this, you really have not understood what the word actually means. There is a very simple reason why it is crucial for the functioning of patriarchy that men's souls be systematically killed. In patriarchy, male life is inherently disposable. It's men who get drafted to die. Men are trash in the sense that it is their purpose to be thrown out when they are not useful. They have no right to exist if they do not serve a purpose to someone else. Every man wants to die a heroic death for a cause greater than themselves. Even if many of us know the impulse is generally pretty stupid, and we deny it, and also we understand that this cause greater than ourselves is not really available to die in, we have that impulse. Because we have been groomed our entire lives to have it. When the war in Ukraine started, a country I have never even been within 500 kilometers of, and with which I am not socially or culturally connected in any way, shape, or form, I felt immense guilt and shame because I didn't go over there to fight against the Russian invasion. I felt like by not throwing away my entire life and going to kill and die, I lost my ability to think of myself as a man. I was unworthy of the gender. You might say I was experiencing gender dysphoria. That war is also an excellent example of male disposability because Ukraine specifically banned fighting-age men from leaving the country and drafted them to be thrown against the invaders. And no one batted an eye at this. There was no widespread analysis of the gender politics of this. I saw one article that basically said it's super sexist that this is happening because it implies that women are not good soldiers and women are actually better at everything than men. And it's like, really? This is the thing you're concerned with when men are being ripped away from the people they love to become dehumanized cogs in the war machine? Women and children first, we hear, to this day, and all we think about is how insulting that is to the women who are so strong. We don't even think about the men who die. We just hope they do it quietly. The cause we die for is usually decided by our patriarchs. In an only slightly different society, we would have been brainwashed into whatever served the patriarch's agenda. And then our ultimate service to society is the glory of a heroic death, the ultimate sublime moment in which we are finally posthumously accepted and respected in our community because we paid with our life to prove our value to it. For men, as a rule, to crave this feeling so much they are willing to sacrifice their life for it, they must be starved of community and trust. They must be alienated. And that is not just about painting their life as inherently worthless in whatever passes for discourse, but also requires making them inherently a problem for the functioning in everyday life. Because we all know that men are not just groomed to be diers. Men are groomed to be killers. The only man more respected and celebrated than one who dies heroically is one who kills heroically. And if you want to be a killer, you need to be comfortable with violence. And to be comfortable with violence, the creation of pain and destruction, you must be free of hesitation. And to be free of hesitation, you must not be burdened with empathy or emotion. What a way to frame it, right? Empathy, emotions, two things that make you human, two things without which arguably you are not fully human, given that our highly sophisticated capacity for empathy and emotional introspection are at the basis of our ability as a species to build complex social networks, which is the most important evolutionary advantage that has brought us to where we are today. But that is the messaging, that is the story we are told, and the story we are sold in every piece of media you see out there. The masculine ideal young boys are confronted with since day one of their childhood is the brave warrior who faces down insane danger without fear or complaint and kills the evil, and then he gets to fuck women as a reward for that. One of the most classic examples of women holding up patriarchy I like to bring up from history is women sticking white poppies onto men who were not fighting in war in order to humiliate them. The hero never dies, he is always successful, whichever of the archetypes he embodies, only gets injured sometimes, which gives him a reason to claim a reward of respite, wherein women attend to him and give him the tenderness his life and soul are utterly barren of, that he cannot find within himself until he is healed and no longer has an excuse to be anything but a machine again. So because he is loyal to his capo, he takes up the heroic mantle of the vicious killer again. We teach boys that violence will get them approval, and are then surprised when they are violent. And this isn't just about dying in war, it's about doing every debased and terrible job in society. Any job that is hard and dangerous, or which requires huge personal sacrifice, it's men doing it, with perhaps the sole exception of prostitution. The lumberjack, the fireman, the police officer, these are images shown to little boys as the way they can attain value as a human being. They contain a lot of gender, whereas professions that are not this, like scientists and teachers, they're always a little bit effeminate, a little gay. Not real men, but useful adjutants to the real man character. They are always beneath him in the domination hierarchy that boys are extremely sensitive to. I really think women have no idea how little they are attuned to understand like male-to-male dominant signaling, and you know, why would they be? What do you associate with the notion of being a kind, gentle, empathetic man? Weakness, vulnerability, fear of being attacked, knowledge that the second a more real manly man comes along, your girlfriend cannot help but get wet for him instead of you because she will realize how much of a pussy you are, and you don't want to be abandoned, do you? Even when the hypermasculine characters do die, which is a grown-up movie thing, they face death stoically, with style and charm, performing being this character instead of having a genuine emotion. When you have a hero man character who is scared in his last moments in a film, that's still a remarkable thing to show today. And look, I think it's cool to fight against genuine evil and to save people from danger and to protect the people you love and the people who are worthy of it. But this is the #1 type of media produced for boys and men, from James Bond to like fucking Conan. And it's propaganda designed to groom little boys into killing their souls. They create an utterly unrealistic, literally impossibly fantastical standard of man to live up to, which you as a man must constantly convince yourself that you see yourself embodied in. Because if you do not identify with James Bond, you are not him. And if you are not him, you are nothing. Even many of the positive models of masculinity we do have for what men could be are just something we can compare real men to. Like, not real men, real life men. They're idealized portrayals displaying all the ways they can be useful to others, divorced from the pain and the immense difficulty they must have conquered in order to become fully themselves. We do not show them suffering in those ways. We just use them to criticize and subjugate, to make men feel inadequate and insecure, and that's not how you help people heal and break from a highly destructive gender performance. Some men are good at this. You have literally no excuse not to be. We just assume men are happy to be presented with these impossible fictional people to be, and have to mentally compare themselves to all the time. If they were even to express a hint of insecurity, society immediately goes, "Oh, you're threatened by a fictional character? You fucking little bruised ego pussy-ass bitch? you insecure fucking manlet. And men know this. They learn very early on how it is acceptable for them to relate to male archetypes in media, because this is always the reaction they get. Men will destroy their bodies to look like buff guys from the movies, and all people will think is, what a fucking moron. I have a very passionate hatred of the sort of media analysis discourse that frames these pieces of gender propaganda as a male power fantasy, when the exact same thing for women is seen as precisely the propaganda that it is. The trad image of being a subservient wife that presses out kids and lives in the house while the husband works is also only a power fantasy in that it promises a fulfillment of a gender archetype and a subsequent acceptance into patriarchal society. If you are this sort of woman, patriarchy will accept you and take care of you, and you will be part of its whole. It's easy to see how ridiculous that is, but when media sets utterly unrealistic standards for men, oh no, that's not bad for them. That is a power fantasy. They want that. Immediately, they want that when they're born as little boys. This is the media they want to consume. It couldn't be that it's the only thing they have. The archetype society constantly bombards them with. No. Boys are just inherently violent and have no emotions, and it's important we don't analyze that. I think it's good to have various different types of characters portrayed in media, especially children's media, even trad archetypes, so long as they are portrayed with a degree of complexity that'll allow these kids to find their own identity. We are not simply passive consumers of propaganda. But really, if you think about it, these boys understand patriarchy the second they pop out of the womb, and how it only gives them advantages. So these little boys, understanding what'll happen in life, they want to be groomed. It's interesting because when a boy is groomed and raped by a teacher, especially if that teacher is female, this is also the main reaction that people have. You will rarely see the word rape in reporting about this thing, even, and the comments will be full of grown-ass men going, "Oh, I wish I had a teacher like that. What a lucky guy." I have seen this happen very up close, and it is hideous. This is just one of the ways patriarchy grooms men to be sexual predators. And it does groom men to be sexual predators. We always have this discourse as, oh, rape culture is a thing because we just let men have what they want and there are no consequences for men and they should be told no, don't do it. Do you think the sexual predator is the kind of person who is deterred by the word no? Again, boys will be boys is not a permission slip, but an expectation to perform gender patriarchally. Only in the really deeply hidden folds of arcane libraries of intersectional feminist discourse is there any analysis happening of why men running free and being allowed to do whatever they want ultimately leads to them being sexual predators. And a lot of that analysis is, given how much we groom boys into associating their own sexuality with monstrosity, and how hard we groom them to be sexual predators, it's wild how few of them there are. Most men can only conceptualize their own sexuality in terms of monstrous and violent domination, even if those things go against the core of their very being. I'd like to preface the following by being very clear about something. Being a bad person because you were groomed to be a bad person, especially when you are an adult, is a reason, not an excuse. Identifying and pointing out the reason a bad thing is happening is not the same as condoning the bad thing that is happening. And I find that when people cannot distinguish that there is a difference between the two, it's a huge red flag, because it suggests that their ethics are based on whether they can conceptualize of a reason to do something, as opposed to a code of ethics or morality or reflection upon the consequences their actions would have on others. You can come up with a reason for the most heinously vile acts ever conceived of, and a lot of people do. So, this is how men are groomed as boys to become sexual predators. Boys are banned from experiencing tenderness and vulnerability, genuine connection. Closing yourself off to that kind of experience is one of the crucial rites of passage into manhood. We've established this. The classic media archetype is that of the young man trying to get the approval of his father, the patriarch, or another woman who is so impressed by his worth to society, his performance of patriarchal masculinity, that he essentially obtains her as a reward, which is rare and thus special. The mother's approval and love is discarded as worthless. Only scarce approval is real. If you take ubiquitous approval, you are a weak and unmanly mama's boy. You will never be a man. You need to win this love from another woman. This is how we're taught to discard most of the approval we are presented with. It is how patriarchy makes sure love does not nourish us. As a boy, you learn very quickly to only accept love if it is gained through performing gender. It is a deep-seated instinct in many men to be suspicious of people who are nice to them for no reason, or to assume that they are into them. We can't really imagine anyone liking us for who we are, as opposed to what we do for them. So you are also given this promise that if you perform the masculine ideal really well, you will get women as a reward and they will give you this tenderness. And you won't have to be afraid of that tenderness, even though your emotional self will be entirely atrophied, because you will dominate this woman. You will not just be impressive enough that she will want you, you will have the power to control her, so she cannot hurt you. And if you cannot create this reality for yourself, if it doesn't materialize, you're a failure. But what happens is that it doesn't materialize. Of course, it's a lie. You are, in fact, even in a romantic relationship, still always required to be performing masculinity. You are not allowed to obtain validation through anything other than acts of subservience and sex. This is why men are so unbelievably obsessed with sex. It is the only permissible way for them to experience human connection and romance. They are taught that sex is romance, and only through having sex can they affirm that they are in fact a man worthy of calling themselves a man. And within that framework, it is only dominant sex that contains gender. If you are submissive in the bedroom as a man, you are shamed for it. If you have any sort of issue that will stop you from performing dominant sex, you are shamed for it. You've seen, all of comedy media where it's just a normal thing to do to shame men's sexuality. The validation of your very self, which, remember, in patriarchal masculinity, affords human beings no value until they are rewarded for the value they've provided, can only be achieved through sexual domination. You either perform sexual domination or you do not exist as a human being. And of course, when women are not throwing themselves at your feet for you to sexually dominate them, it makes you feel like a failure. Patriarchy has made it so men can only feel human when they sexually dominate. This is why rape isn't just about sexual approval, it's about power. Everyone needs to feel powerful, but men are funneled into this particular thing as the only valid strategy for them to feel powerful. And because this presents the way it does, men's very sense of self is tied to their sexual conquests. But they are also shamed for their very existence as sexual beings, because they're inherently monstrous. I've talked before about how the impression left deep in my soul is that when I have sex with someone, I am taking something from them. And this has made me deeply ashamed of my own sexuality, because I cannot bear that guilt. It took me a long time to get over that, and I'm not sure I fully have. I still feel bad when I am nice to people sometimes, because I feel like I'm deceiving them into liking me. Deep down, I know I am a monster who is unworthy of this. You learn eventually that society knows the only way you can feel like a person is by taking that away from someone else, and that is a monstrous act. Men are not affirmed as inherently sexually valid, but as born rapists. And in our world, we have taught women to say no, which is, and this is true, good. Unfortunately, without at the same time giving men a way to find any sort of selfhood outside of sexual affirmation. This is one of the reasons why masculinity is in crisis. When everyone tells you you are a monster, the easiest way to deal with that is to accept it. But when we talk about teenage boys and young men watching Andrew Tate and his disgusting ilk, we do it like it's their fault this is the only role model they're given to understand the shame and self-hatred we saddle them with. People like Andrew Tate prey on the emotional vulnerability of men and boys by pushing the patriarchal line that blames women, and specifically feminism, for not fulfilling these impossible to fulfill constant sexual affirmations that patriarchy promised. And they can do that because while in our modern world we have abundancy of places where women and minorities can disengage from patriarchal life for a little bit and enjoy the protection of a bubble wherein reflection and discourse are allowed, this isn't true for men. On the contrary, it has been primarily patriarchal feminist efforts that have used real-world power to stop men from creating spaces where they can have respite from constant patriarchal pressure. Whenever intersectional feminists try to have a go at it, they are ripped apart in the activist space. And whenever men try it, they are MRA Nazi misogynists, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where shame drives men who actually do want to get out of patriarchy to never engage with these spaces that are often entirely valid issues in their conception and are not in fact women-hating extremists until the point where they have been so caricaturized in the public discourse that foaming at the mouth misogynists are the only people left in them, at which point, of course, that is taken as proof that this was the case all along. The primary actionable solution offered to boys as men is to basically not be men. The entire gender is inherently rejected as corrupt, and you're essentially encouraged to be a castrated new male with no spine or personality, which is really just priming men for being dominated in a patriarchal framework where some women are allowed to be patriarchs. Most men do not want that. Most men want to be men, but the only people who tell them that is okay are ultimately the misogynists, and anti-male feminists will be the first in participating in the process of driving them there by constantly digging into the wounds patriarchal grooming left in their minds. They will be told that actually the whole world is made for them. They have no problems, which they can clearly see and understand is not the case, otherwise they would not be in crisis. All that happens on the left is that they are belittled and have their feelings dismissed. How dare you say they should know better than to turn away from us, when you are causing them the exact pain they are trying to run away from, driving them into the arms of people who at least pretend to do otherwise. That is literally victim-blaming people for having been groomed. The unfortunate truth of this being that, as with all things that harm, a tiny number of perpetrators can cause an enormous number of victims. Most of the women, especially feminists I know, do not explicitly believe these things. They often even have some understanding of the issues. But their behaviors are informed by patriarchy as well, much like the behaviors of men that they perform casually without any ill intent are often also patriarchal. Most of the time, any male expression of sexual frustration specifically is going to be belittled, unless it is paired with anger. And I mean really all of their needs, and all of their non-needs, and all of their everything. Anger is, I believe, the crux of this issue. Because when every emotion but anger has been taken away from you, every emotion that tries to be felt is going to manifest as anger. It becomes a generic placeholder emotion. And I think we all understand this intuitively when it comes to fear. Fear in men is usually expressed as anger. We are angry that we are afraid, with ourselves for feeling this emotion of powerlessness, and with the people making us feel it, to an extent where we just assume that anger is just fear, which isn't true. Embarrassment is similar. It's also an emotion of powerlessness, which is something that to men is death, because it means losing out in the system of dominance. I am an advocate of anger. I think it is an emotion that has been unjustly maligned in modern society as inherently unjustifiable, or rather amusingly to me, a loss of control over yourself, when it's really quite the opposite. I think because we are confronted with the ways in which anger can be toxic, and which it can make other people feel out of control and out of power, often and especially during our most vulnerable years, many of us are uncomfortable with the emotion in the same way men are uncomfortable with all other emotions that are not anger. Which, if you are one of those people who cannot feel anger in a way that isn't utterly horrifying, that's the male experience for like every emotion, pretty much. The purpose of anger is to make us strong. to allow us to stand firm in conflict, to fight, to motivate us to proactively do things instead of just reacting. Anger helps us fight for causes, against tyranny, for the protection of people we love. It ironically can put us at ease in situations we find very uncomfortable. I am a very strong believer that democracy cannot exist without anger, because democracy thrives on conflict just as much as it does compromise. If you cannot stand in conflict, no compromise will ever be a compromise, simply what the other party wanted. But when not alloyed with other sensible emotions, anger quickly becomes a blunt instrument, not fit for purpose. And if it's the only emotion you have, you start to see some truly twisted manifestations of it. For instance, do you know anger can be used to express love? When I'm angry, you do as I say, because you fear me. So I express my love for you as anger, because I can control you with it. And when you feel controlled by me, you feel loved by me, because you know that I care about you. To people who didn't grow up with the male lived experience, this can feel utterly alien. But it's the only way for men to feel in strictly patriarchal terms. You might be more familiar with the positive expectation of that emotion, which is in itself also toxic, of wanting to stand on the right side of the power that anger creates in a man. Your man has anger and does violence to people, but not to you. You are shielded from it and protected by it. This is a fantasy that's very common for women, and I understand why. It doesn't have to be inherently evil either. But men, in being taught to expect this, are strongly encouraged to behave in a manner that is toxic to the people around them in order to prove that they can be that aggressive protector type of man. This is why women like bad boys, and why that's actually not cool and not as innocuous as you might think. In a system as sophisticated as patriarchy, having gone through thousands of years of mimetic evolution, everything serves more than one purpose. So there is a vile elegance to the fact that anger is not just how the patriarchy uses men to keep women in check, it's also the force that alienates men. Because anger begets fear when there is no anger to rise to meet it, and women have been taught to fear instead of anger. It's a core component of emotional abuse to deprive victims of their anger precisely because they could find strength in it. The feminist movement has often been fueled by anger. That's why it has achieved so many things for women. Minorities often culturally rely on their anger in order to continue their struggle against oppression, and it's no surprise that the image of the angry black man is used to scare white suburbanites into seeing them as incapable of participating in civilized society, alienating these groups from one another. Anger pushes, so if it is the only way you can express yourself, you're going to push every time you get emotional, which not only will make people less likely to engage with you emotionally, but will also make you afraid of your own emotions, because you know it will push others away if you engage with them. It is not a privilege to be feared. It is an experience of alienation. We avoid things we fear. And if we confront them with anger, which is in itself an alienating emotion. And it kills me that so many boys think and understand that being feared may be the only status they ever attain at all. They strive for it to protect themselves from things that are more terrifying, and think of it as power, when really it does nothing but make them stand alone. It's a vicious cycle that keeps the people who ought to be connecting to one another, gaining empathy for each other's struggles, alienated and separate. There is a balance of women being able to conceptualize their issues but unable to do anything about them due to the distribution of power in society, with men being inherently unable to conceptualize these issues in the first place, because that is how you best keep them from fixing them. The general threat of men is yet again utilized to keep women terrified. And to keep that the case, men's souls need to be killed. Men do pose a real threat to women, and also men. And patriarchy will try to remind you of this at every turn, so it is always present in your mind. Always there is an alienating force, a real threat looming much larger than it is, because the easiest way to intimidate someone is to shove a real gun in their face. And yes, it is also women's job to fix this. If you subscribe to the idea that it is in fact everyone's job to fix patriarchy, this is just the case. It is good when men in positions of power use that power to be allies to women and all kinds of marginalized groups. So use your power to understand emotions and give validation to be allies to men. Realize that the trauma of men sits so deep that the process of healing requires a lot of time and attention, and because of the patriarchal man image, we're not ready to afford men this. Simultaneously, much like men must divorce themselves from the idea of a subservient slave wife, women must divorce themselves from the idea of a mighty warrior husband who will protect them from all dangers, real and imagined, with no regard for his own life and safety. If a guy won't beat another guy's ass because he insulted my honor, he is worthless, is just as patriarchal as a guy saying if a woman won't bring me a beer and make me a sandwich, she is worthless. And just to address all the women who just went, well, I don't expect that from a guy, that would be insane. It's actually kind of a red flag. Yes, you are correct. Thank you for being the way you are. But as a guy, I can tell you, you'd be surprised. And I hope you can gain some empathy for men who feel an irresistible urge to do just that. Imagine this. You date a guy, and whenever there is danger, he hides behind you, like physically hides behind you, doesn't even consider the possibility of doing anything to protect you, but actually does expect you to protect him with your life. Do you feel that's hot? Because that's the male experience. Also, and you know this is kinda true, kind women who go out there, who do the work of meeting men with trust and empathy are seen as naive and often patriarchal, when, as we have established, the opposite is true, because they do hard and dangerous work in overcoming alienation. The way to fight the system of alienation and division is not through hatred and antagonism, but empathy and understanding for each other's plight. We need to learn to build trust with each other and with ourselves. Men need to realize that it is not feminism that is to blame for patriarchy's failure to deliver on its empty promises. We need to practice introspection and self-love. Not all ways in which patriarchy oppresses men can be fixed primarily by men. But with this one, we have some strategies on our hands. Unfortunately, it's a very hard type of project that you need to do personally. Like, you need to get in touch with your emotions and find within yourself a sense of empathy. There are many ways to do this, but I realize not every man can go to therapy, so I am bringing a little therapy to you. This right here is called an emotion wheel. It's not the only one of its kind. Some define finer emotions differently. None of them are really wrong. And you use this to become better and better at identifying how you feel. You start in the middle with the basic 6 emotions, the big ones. Name what you are feeling, like one of them, and then see if you can't go a level deeper with the subcategories attached to that. And if you can, maybe go a level deeper than that once again. Do this at least once a day, just to check in, to get into the habit of listening to your emotions at all. Print it out, carry it around in your wallet, and whenever you're feeling emotions, start in the middle, try working your way forward. In this process, remember to give yourself grace. You are healing a wound. One of the few types of wounds that can actually be actively healed by working on healing it. Like, how fucking cool is that in terms of masculinity? It's basically a limb you can regrow. It's fine if you feel anger or fear or sadness. That's okay. Like, you didn't do it wrong. The purpose of this is not to make you feel different, it's to help you learn to understand how you feel with no judgment. You should be shooting lasers, but you gotta know which color lasers you're shooting with to make you more emotionally resilient, because, ironically, get this, right? Though you have been shaped to feel and express only anger because it makes you more able to project power, it doesn't actually make you more powerful. You don't project that power on your own behalf. You project it on behalf of the patriarchy. Not understanding all this shit about yourself leaves you extremely vulnerable to emotional manipulation. It's like you're attached to this anger string, right? And it's the only string that you have to your emotions. And if I can pull this string around, I can manipulate you with your anger. But the more strings you have that go to the center, the more emotions you have that you understand, the more difficult it becomes for me to jerk you around by your anger or any of the other emotions. Because the other strings, they will hold you firm. Which is, of course, the point of all this. It's supposed to keep you on the leash of your patriarch or whoever is able to control that emotion. It's very common in our society to, like, as a woman, learn to, like, manipulate your man's anger. And let me tell you something. If you are looking to be out there having a relationship with a woman, or really any type of person, my guy, being good at this is better than having titanium abs and a dick shaped like a cucumber. Women have a fucking radar for this skill set. Being a genuinely emotionally self-reflected man that can communicate and respect other people's emotions with empathy, who is emotionally resilient, but also capable of the vulnerability required for genuine human connection, they're gonna snatch you up like you're on sale. So try it out, work on it, and good luck on your journey. I'll be right here when you actually, make it. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities. I was aiming for it to be like a lot shorter than it is, but thoughts are as big as they are, and they need to be described in as many words as they need to be described in. YouTube doesn't love this kind of content, so I would appreciate if you could, like, support me on Patreon, or buy some of I have new merchandise. This is crazy. I made this new merch. This is the main design. It's just me doing this pose. I saw you could get a bath mat with this, and I thought this would be a great image. So you look down at me doing this pose when you come out of the shower. And also these sort of mugs, you can get fanny packs and, like, switch cases and phone cases and all that. With some of the thumbnail designs, because it's one of the most requested things I've had. Like, can you do merch with some of the thumbnail backgrounds that you make? I'll be updating that every once in a while. And yeah, basically, see you around, cunts.